Good evening and welcome. Welcome to tonight's annual Chaplaincy New Year lecture slot. My name is Mark Laynesmith. I am the Anglican Chaplain here at the University of Aberdeen. Well, each year the Chaplaincy aims to invite a guest speaker to come and address an issue of contemporary interest from a theological perspective. And this year our topic is spirituality and mental health, and I am delighted to welcome from the University of Aberdeen, Professor John Swinton. John is a Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care, and he is the founding director of Aberdeen Centre for Spirituality, Health and Disability. The range of subjects he's written on as an academic is quite remarkable. His theological work includes books on topics such as adoption, dementia, end-of-life care, disability, and the topic of evil. But alongside his academic work, John has also worked as a practitioner, both as a registered psychiatric nurse and as a mental health chaplain. Tonight, I'm delighted to be interviewing him about his 2020 book, Finding Jesus in the Storm, The Spiritual Lives of Christians with Mental Health Challenges. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'll pose some questions which I've drawn from his book, and then towards the end of our session, I'll put to him some of your own questions. So if you would like to ask something, please do write in the Q&A section of the Microsoft Teams Live. This session will be recorded and you will be able to watch it again later. So without further ado, John, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's a very kind introduction.
Thank you. John, just for other people's benefit, because I know quite a bit, obviously, can you give us a little potted biography? How on earth did you manage to fit in being a psychiatric nurse, a chaplain and an academic? That's three careers, surely.
Well, yes, it probably is three careers in some sense, or at least three vocations. So I actually began my working life as a van driver, which was one of my most enjoyable jobs. Simply because it was straightforward. You know, you go out in the morning, you deliver your stuff, and you come back at night, so you don't have to spend the whole night worrying about theological problems, which seems to be the bane of my life since I started my PhD. So I nursed in mental health for 16 years in the area of mental health and the area of learning disabilities. Before I kind of moved on and decided to go to university to study theology. I thought at that time I'd end up as a hospital chaplain, and I did work in chaplaincy for a while because my father was a chaplain. And not that chaplaincy is genetically passed on through families, but it just seemed the obvious thing for me to do. But once I got to university, and once I actually started to study practical theology, I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I worked down in Glasgow for a year, and then I came back to Aberdeen, and I've been here ever since. I've been here since 1997, which seems like forever.
What drew you to the psychiatric nursing? I mean, to go from van driving to that's quite a leap among the many leaps.
Well, it's funny, that's true. Because, you know, oftentimes when you're thinking about vocation, you think, you know, you have a big revelation and suddenly God shows you the right thing to do. I just didn't know what to do. One of my pals became a mental health nurse, so I thought, oh, I'll become a mental health nurse. And that was that was it, basically. So I left my job driving a van and ended up working as a nurse and loved that. And so I left when I left nursing. It wasn't because I was fed up with it. It's just because I felt drawn to do something different than theology. So then I left that and started again. So it just happens in life. And I managed to get ordained in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland along the way as well.
John, I was looking through your list of books, and they really do go through some quite remarkable and quite remarkably different topics. What's brought you to the topic of this particular book? So I think the last one was on dementia.
The last one was actually on disability. The one before that was on dementia. And yes, kind of looking at the issue of memory and how that relates to people, theologically to people living with dementia. Then I wrote a book on time, looking specifically at profound intellectual disability, brain damage and time. And then I came to this book. And the reason I got into this book is because for a long time I'd been kind of fascinated by the different ways in which people talk about mental health issues, and the difference between the way in which professionals formally talk about mental health and the way in which people seem to experience it. And that's something obviously that goes back to my nursing experience, where you know, on one hand, you have a system or a way of caring for people that seeks to eradicate symptoms, but on the other hand, some symptoms people don't necessarily want to have eradicated, and you've got a kind of clash of discourses, clash of understandings of health and that. And I wanted just to think, well, what would it look like if we think about Christians and we think about not simply what schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, mental health and major depression are, but how Christians experience them. What does it mean? And in particular, what does it mean for your faith? And so developing a thick description that gets into the detail, which that's what I wanted to do, because I was curious, but also aware that if we listen carefully to people's stories, then your range of options for being together in the midst of these things expands. If you only look at it from one dimension, then you see one thing. But if you look at it from a variety of dimensions, then the range of possibilities for intervention, care, living well expands.
Yeah, we'll come back to that lovely idea of the thick description, which you get from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, and we'll look at some thin descriptions and why they're problematic. But just to dwell on that a little bit longer, it sounds almost like this kind of bubbled up inside rather than I've got to write an academic book. Was it a little more personal?
Yeah, to be honest with you, Mark, I've never sat down and think I have to write an academic book. And I mean, obviously there are pressures from the academy, but I think one of the beauties of being in Aberdeen, and one of the gifts Aberdeen's given to me, is that they've allowed me to develop my own ideas in whatever way I want. In the sense that as long as it's kind of academically rigorous, and as long as it's doing the job it's supposed to do, they've allowed me to look at a whole range of different things and to create a whole range of get involved in a whole range of areas. So yeah, it's personal, but then probably every book I've written is personal, because I mean, to some extent, all theology is autobiography, and that's not all it is, but it contains autobiography. And that's certainly, when I look back on my career and the areas I've looked at, a lot of that is autobiographical. It comes from me and from the questions that emerge from my experience with people, which I then think about in a theological context. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's a good deal of me in there.
So it clearly builds on, I think, 2 years of interviews that you undertook with Christians who were experiencing mental health challenges. What was the actual process like? I mean, how do you recruit people for those sorts of things?
Well, the technical term for it is snowballing. And so you find somebody who's living with the particular experience that you want to look at. It's a standard qualitative research approach. And then they pass you on to somebody else, and then they pass you on to somebody else. And so eventually people become familiar with the fact that you're doing this study, and then people come to you. So people came to me from all different places for all different reasons, and I'm sure. But the main reason that, I mean, I spoke to probably in the region of 60 people. And I would say all of them, the reason that they wanted to be involved with the study is because they wanted this perspective to become something that people took seriously. And so I actually almost didn't write the book, and the reason I got halfway through it and I almost stopped, because I had this wrestle about whether I was trying to represent a group of people that could perfectly well represent themselves, or whether I was standing on people's toes, and whether I was misrepresenting. But when I had the conversations with the people that were involved with the study, what they wanted was for me to work with their story. So they gave me permission to do that. Like, so I'm sure none of what I do is perfect, but I think that because of my experience, because of my theological training, I was able to articulate things in a way that was helpful for people. So I didn't pack it in, and I'm glad I didn't there. And I just took what people said to me. Okay, I'll do my best to represent you as faithfully as I can in the midst of the questions that I have in my own head.
And very, very sadly, I think one particular influence on the book took his own life, a friend of yours.
He did. That was a real sad part of the study. I mean, I was very pleased and honoured to get his story and to have a good. I mean, I had known him before this study, and the testimony that he gave me was lovely. It was really just really nice. And you know, his mum said it was fine just to use his name as who he was, as a testament to him. And so, yeah, it's a tragedy, but actually he brings to light some very beautiful things that I think there means that, well, I think he's represented well in the book, and I think it probably does serve as a testimony to him.
Yeah, and you quote quite extensively from different interviews, so you really do get a flavour of the voices of the different people. So I think you're right. It does represent them as testimony, give witness to them.
Yeah.
One of the things that I guess I found most helpful about the whole book, the book as a whole, was that you want to be really careful about the language. I guess it is one thing that I really got. It was that we need to be much more careful about the language. Even the expression mental health illness, you say, no, let's talk about mental health challenges. So right at the start, you mentioned, for example, how often when we talk about mental health difficulties, the language used is militaristic. It's about fighting and battling and struggling with. Tell us a little bit about why it's important to find the right language.
Well, the reason it's important to find the right language is because language shapes and forms what we think we see. So the language they use about anything in the world tells us something about what we think it is. So it describes it in that sense. And what we think we're looking at through the description of that language will define how we respond to it. So if you use militaristic language like battling and suffering, then that's how you'll respond to it. And pull your socks up, get going. And that can be very difficult when you're in the midst of real difficulties. So it's just that way that language shapes and forms our perspective and the way that we respond to it. And that's particularly sharp, I think, in the context of mental health, where language is important. So the language of diagnosis is very important. It's important for mental health professionals because it enables them to do their job well and to use their healing talents effectively. So to have a diagnostic criterion like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, whatever you have, that's helpful. The problem is when that leaks out into society and people like you and me who are not, at least not at the moment, clinicians, begin to use that and begin to use that as our ideas are shaped and formed, not by the individual before you, but by caricatures and stereotypes and by Hollywood and by a whole range of different ways. And then language becomes a barrier to accessing relationships because you've already decided what you think you should see, and that's, surprise, surprise, what you will see. And one of the things I've tried to do in this book is to put to one side the standard assumptions about what a diagnosis should look like and really try to listen to what's going on in front of me as best as I can. And I think that's what we all should do, because there's a big difference between talking about a schizophrenic and talking about David or Alan or Frida. It's just like a completely different kind of discourse. And I think for Christians, for the church, that's the key. That's one of the big gifts that the church brings, is the gift of value and the gift of giving people space to reclaim their own stories. Because if you think about it, how do you get value? You don't get, well, some people wake up in the morning and say, I'm wonderful. But for most people, you get value and it's given to you. So value is a gift. You can't become a friend of somebody on your own. Somebody has to give you the gift of friendship. So value is always that kind of gifted, always has that kind of gifted nature. And I think in this context, simply giving somebody space to tell their own story and to listen to it and to take it seriously and to call them by their name is a profound gift. And it's a simple gift, but it's a profound gift of value.
You also use the expression, somebody is living under the diagnosis of. I mean, even that expression is very interesting.
Yeah, well, the way I talk about it in the book is under the description of. The description. And so it's suggesting that lots of different, you have lots of different descriptions for lots of different things. You're even something like your car. At one level, you might describe it as your heart's desire, or you might describe it as just something that's functional. So the way you describe something is significant. But the point is that you have lots of different descriptions for many things. If I was describing you, Mark, I wouldn't just describe one dimension. You're a Homo sapien. I'd say you're a pastor, you're a family, etc., etc., etc. So that I'd be developing things like that. The problem with the way in which sometimes we use language in the context of mental health is you only have a single description. So you have bipolar disorder. And once people are thinking that way, all these other descriptions, you're a family, you have family, you have friends, you are an accountant, all these just get sucked into or hidden by this big, powerful social label. And so descriptions become really important. And what I try to do is to develop multiple descriptions. So note that there's nothing wrong with a medical description, a diagnostic criterion at all. As I say, I emphasize that there's nothing wrong with psychiatry and psychology. But there are other ways of describing people's experiences, and capturing that does get us to a different space with a different range of possibilities.
So this is our thick description. It also uses, you use the philosophy of phenomenology to sort of, as it were, look at something from within rather than the sort of objectivizing. Yeah. So the misuse of descriptions, I think, possibly is into something that you call the creation of spoiled identities. I wonder what you meant by that expression, spoiled. Well,
that's not my expression. I'd love to claim it. I think it's actually Erving Goffman, who's a sociologist, a microsociologist, and he talks about the way in which your identity is spoiled by a stigma, whatever that stigma is. And so stigma occurs when you reduce something to only one element of it. So Goffman says that stigma emerges from the Greek slave trade, where a slave trader would buy somebody, put a mark on them, and as soon as they are marked, that's all they are. They're simply a mark. They're no longer a person, no longer have a name, no longer have family, etc., etc. They're a mark. And stigma has a tendency to do that. So when you have what's a culturally devalued condition, something like maybe dementia, as an example, if you've got a culture that really is very keen on intellect, reason, memory, quick thinking, then that's going to be a culturally devalued condition, because that's the things you're losing. So if that happens, then you end up with an identity that's placed upon you by society that's negative, and it spoils the things that are under there. The other excellent things that could be there are spoiled by the application of this powerful label.
I have to admit, I had no idea that was the origin of the word stigma, and I think just to have that association, it's the brand that would be put on you when if a person was enslaved, and I think that really helps to sort of unpack the language of stigma, and then the way that it actually conditions life and limits it in other ways. Now, many of us will know that a key tool in the sort of the psychiatric responses to mental ill health is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, I didn't know very much about it, the DSM, and I certainly didn't know really kind of how it was supposed to be used. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the DSM and its background, but also why you have some reserve about it, or at least the way it's used.
Sure, but the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, used primarily in America, but to a lesser extent in Europe, as if you like, the Bible of diagnosis. So in that is all of the criterion that medics will use to define what kind of condition that you have. So if there's certain symptoms are laid out, if you have depression, schizophrenia, or eating disorder, whatever it is. And so you have this manual, and in principle, I'm sure not all medics do this, you go to this and it gives you guidance as to what kind of a condition the person has. And it's important because for certain journals, it's not possible to publish research unless the criteria are met within the DSM. And for certain insurance policies in the United States in particular, you have to have a diagnosis from the DSM before you can claim certain things. So it's a very powerful book. The problem is two things. The way it's constructed is it's not scientific in the way you might expect. What tends to happen is that, well, what does happen is that psychiatrists gather from time to time in hotels in the US and argue their way towards what's to be in, what's to be out in the criterion, which leads to an unusual kind of situation where mental health challenges come and go. So something like Asperger's, with the new revision of the DSM criterion, it no longer exists. So it's subsumed into the category of autism. And that becomes problematic. So if you have created an identity as someone with Asperger's, and there's a really very, very interesting Asperger's community that talks about the importance of that as an identity, and then suddenly it's taken a lot, it comes along and it's no longer there, then there are issues like that. So it's a kind of interesting, but the point, the critical point is it focuses on symptoms and illness, because that's what it's intended to do. But in Europe, they use what's called the ICD-10, or ICD-11 as it is now, International Classification of Diseases. That's for physical and psychological diseases. And they're just moving towards, and we actually have done that, ICD-11. And I read a really fascinating paper the other day. They were asking some service users what their opinions was on the ICD criterion. That's similar to DSM, but there's significant differences. And so people with personality disorder, people with schizophrenia, depression, and bipolar disorder, and something else that eludes me for the moment, were asked to look at the criterion here and to give their opinion on it. And one of the most fascinating things was that they pointed out that it's all negative. And so people with bipolar disorder said, well, where's the space for creativity? Where's the space for the things that, okay, they can be destructive, but where's the place for those of us who are artists or musicians, for whom that high can be very creative? Why is that not part of the condition rather than just part of somebody's life? So you can begin to see that there's a tension there. So these kind of diagnostic criteria lay out things that are kind of wrong with people, but actually there's a whole other story there that doesn't ignore that, but isn't necessarily defined or confined by it.
I thought that was fascinating, and it's going to make me rethink about the DSM a little bit more and its use. Linked to it, you point out that a recent trend has been for people to respond to challenges of mental ill health by likening it to a biological process. You have depression; it's just your brain. As a way initially of trying to destigmatize it, but you actually point out that maybe that's not all that helpful. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit about the issues underlying there of linking mental ill health and biological processes.
Yeah, well, part of that conversation relates to the fact that certain strands of psychiatry are becoming more and more biologically and neurologically oriented. So it's like kind of a movement away from that Freudian psychoanalysis way of thinking about people towards a more materialist way of thinking about thinking. And so if that kind of way of thinking, it's all your biology, does fit in with that paradigm. And at one level, it helps to destigmatize because it draws mental health challenges into the same kind of paradigm as physical challenges, and in principle says it's all biology, so therefore there's no need to stigmatize. And there's a logic in that. The research isn't completely clear that actually happens, but there is a logic in that. But the problem is, if you do that, you forget that the experiences that people are going through are very, very meaningful. Even something like hearing voices, which is almost like paradigmatic of what people are, kind of mark out as something radically different, actually are meaningful experiences. Now, if you simply say, yes, you maybe think they're meaningful experiences, but it's just merely biology, then you have a clash of stories. It may be biology, but it doesn't make it any less meaningful, and both in terms of origin and in terms of how you deal with it. But also, how do you feel if you find that your mental health condition is ontological, is who you are, is what you are? So if you have influenza, people don't say to you, oh, you are the flu. But if you have a neurological condition that ties itself so closely to biological functions, then you become it. You become schizophrenia, or you become bipolar disorder, whatever it is. And that's a different frame, and that's a more difficult frame for people to work with. Now, for some people, that's a really helpful frame. So my point would be that frame it in any way you want. I'm not the neurological police in this sense, or not even the language police in that way. However, for other people, it is problematic. And so recognizing that tension within what's intended to be a helpful way of thinking about things, and can be a helpful way of thinking about things, but at the same time there are other dimensions that need to be taken into consideration.
So we're really looking at the power of language, the power it has over people, which can sometimes be beneficial. A diagnosis may be helpful, but it depends on who's on the receiving end and how you receive it.
It does. It depends what that means to you for your identity. And for some people, it's a good explanatory framework, and that's fine. For other people, it effectively, like saying you have to take medication for the rest of your life, and that's the end of your life. And of course, that's not the case. Like, because having to take medication is a good thing, and it's not the end of your life. But it can feel that way if that's the way that it's explained it. My body's gone so horribly wrong that I have to be ill forever. And one of the things I'm keen to think about is, yes, you may have, anybody may have symptoms and experiences forever, but that doesn't mean to say that you have to be ill forever. But you have to think of a different way of thinking about health to get to that space.
So this is this bit about ontology, making a diagnosis, something that's essentially you, rather than sort of actually maybe there's some symptoms that you happen to have at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, you wrote, you mentioned in the book that you wrote in the 90s that you once lamented that spirituality was being ignored in the way we respond to mental ill health. And you write quite ruefully that you've now changed your mind quite firmly. Can you say why?
Well, yes, true. I wrote a book back in 1999, 2000, whatever it is, called Spirituality and Mental Health Care, Remembering the Forgotten Dimension, but the forgotten dimension is well and truly remembered now. But the problem is that very often the kinds of understandings of spirituality that we see are so vague as to be sometimes unhelpful. So if you have a vague idea of spirituality as meaning, purpose, value, hope, and for some people God, that at least opens up a space beyond a purely medical approach. So it does good work at there. The problem is there's no parameter. It could be meaning about anything, and with that kind of understanding of spirituality, which I'm not opposed to, I'm just conscious of its limits. It becomes a very internal, personal thing. It's my meaning and my purpose and my value, and it fits in very well with individualistic culture. But we're social beings, and spirituality, it seems to me, is always tied in with other people, always tied in with communities. So the danger is that these kinds of definitions become thin and helpful because they raise people within a healthcare system. They raise people's consciousness to the importance of these kinds of questions and issues and dimensions. But at the same time, when you give it a prod, it's difficult sometimes to see what it is. I mean, you're a chaplain, Mark. You must have encountered some of the tensions around spirituality.
I think I find that the way that we, as we've already been sort of picking up, that we have to learn to use certain languages in certain places. So the
right.
language I might use with student services might be a very different language I might use for a particular individual who's from a particular faith tradition, and it's learning to move between those, isn't it? I think.
Yes, that's well put.
Let's move on to the second half, the real sort of central bit of the book, where you look at three major topics. You look at serious depression. You then look at schizophrenia, which you helpfully talk about using the language of hearing voices. And then finally, we look at bipolar disorder. So I'd like in the next maybe 10 minutes to sort of go through those sort of one at a time. And let's start with sort of major depression. You try and work up a sort of thicker description, a broader description of what it's like to experience depression. And you come up with a really lovely section where you talk about it as being the absence of joy, not the absence of happiness. And then you go on to mention something which I'd never thought about, but St. Paul, and in fact the rest of the Christian tradition, talks a lot about joy, never talks about happiness, does it? No. So tell me a bit about describing the experience of depression using the language of the absence of joy and what joy might mean in this context.
Well, first of all, joy, the way that I think about it, is an experience. Joy is separate from happiness, right? So when Paul lays out the gifts of the Spirit, he doesn't talk about happiness. He talks about joy. And so happiness is a passing emotion. It comes and it goes, but joy seems to be deeply tied in with Jesus. So Jesus is our joy in that sense, as Karl Barth puts it. But within that concept of joy, when Scripture talks about joy, it incorporates suffering, it incorporates lostness, incorporates a whole range of things. So it's not that joy is to be joyful is to be happy, but to be joyful is to find your joy, to hold on to your center point, which ultimately should be God. And so to find joy in the midst of depression doesn't mean to find happiness in the midst of depression. It means to be able to hold on to that center point, that anchor point of your faith, even in the midst of the difficulties. And of course, that's what's so difficult about depression, because very often you can't do that. But the way in which the people that I spoke to began to talk about that, and the way in which I began to think about that was, one of the big experiences that people have is the experience of abandonment. So abandonment is that complete lack of joy, that sense that God has just completely disappeared. And that's oftentimes reinforced by Christians who say, well, really, it must be your own fault. You probably haven't prayed enough, or you haven't been formally well enough, or you haven't read Scripture. And so you've got this horrible experience of you lose sight of your joy, and everybody else is saying it's your own fault. And I think to myself, that can't be right. But then I began to think, well, what does Scripture have to say about this? And so you've got that idea in Deuteronomy where God will never abandon us. Where God's always there, God will never abandon us. And Paul talks about that as well. Yeah. At the same time that you have Isaiah, and Isaiah, I can't remember, 43 or thereabouts, saying God's God who hides. So how can you have the presence of God as always here, and at the same time have the presence of God as God hiding and absent? And of course, you turn to the Psalms of Lament, more Psalms of Lament than any other psalm, and that's probably for a good reason. And you find that a psalm like Psalm 88 ends, darkness is my only companion. Mm-hmm. And then you begin to think, well, the psalmist is not speaking into the void. The psalmist is speaking to God. And the problem is not a lack of faith, it's a lack of connection. He just can't find God in the midst of the darkness. It's not that he thinks God is not there, he just can't find him. And you see the same thing in God, in Jesus' abandonment on the cross, when he cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? Gone is the language of Abba, the closeness of Father, and suddenly this sense of abandonment is there. So when you begin to look at that perspective on that idea of abandonment, you can quite quickly see that actually it's part of our tradition. It's a part of our tradition we don't speak about. It's part of our tradition we're very nervous about. But when you encounter somebody with depression, to have that part of your tradition available to you is a wonderful gift, because it just gives a completely different perspective. And it takes away that idea of blaming people for this, because we have a tradition there. We maybe need to learn how to worship it. We need to live with it. We need to learn how to preach it and teach it. This is part of our spiritual journey. So that when we encounter depression or encounter people living with depression, we have that spiritual perspective to bring to the situation. And so joy has to do with, in that context, when you lose your connection, you lose your joy. But if we take the body of Christ seriously, your joy can be held by other people. So you hold my joy while I can't do it, and wait for me to come back. And we can become reconnected. And I think all that pushes into a very interesting model of church in the end, and church and liturgy, if we think it through.
So one of the things you've done there is say, let's treat Scripture as, rather than just sort of one kind of single answer, as it were, a sort of text word, it's actually more a sort of repertoire of different kinds of experience. So we could go to the Psalms, as you say, the Psalms of Lament, and we could find ways of describing our experience of depression.
Yes, well, exactly. And if we're allowing the experiences of people with depression to help us to understand what the psalmist is saying, then that actually acts as a kind of practical hermeneutic that enables us to see the kind of multivocal dimensions of the Psalms that we may not notice otherwise. I mean, I'm a practical theologian, and my focus is on disability. And one of the things that practical theologians do is take questions from experience and place them against scripture and tradition. In the same way as a systematic theologian will take issues from history and develop things in that way, practical theology takes a series of questions from experience. And once you ask these questions, and in this case, it's this kind of research, you're trying to get people with various experiences to bring new questions to the table. And when that happens, you have new possibilities for understanding, hopefully, something of the complexities of Revelation more fully.
There's a couple of nice bits you quote people saying that they had gone to a religious service where the focus actually was on using the Psalms of Lament. They spent the entire service using this language, and you suggest that actually churches could really support people by using a much richer range of scripture and allowing some of the stuff that might make us feel a bit uncomfortable about God's absence or feeling God's absence. We should be using this language more often.
Exactly, and one of the examples I use in the book is of a gentleman who, together with his pastor, created a liturgy for one Sunday focused on depression. So the songs, the prayers, the sermon was all in that, which was great. But what was so interesting was that after the service, numerous people from the congregation came to him and said, you know, I've suffered with depression for many, many years. I always thought it was just because I was a bad Christian. But now I see that actually there's something more than that now. So once people find it a safe space to talk, then they're able to learn new things. Finding a safe space is not always the best, not always an easy thing to do, because as soon as you start that conversation, you make yourself vulnerable, and sometimes religious communities can be difficult for that. But in that situation, simply making it part of the liturgical life of the church, and to identify with it.
Now, I think it's in the section on major depression that you first talk about medication. And you talk about the possibility of pharmaceutical intervention being used, and here I quote you, soulfully as a practical theological enterprise. I wonder what you meant by that. Medication that's soulfully used as practical theology.
Yeah, I wonder what I meant by that. No, one of the controversies sometimes with Christians is that they're reluctant to use medication in the context of mental health, because they think that perhaps prayer should be more effective and other ways of dealing with it. People don't tend to do that on the whole for physical health, but something about mental health. But the way I think about it is, you know, if you're in an end-of-life care situation where you're dying of cancer, for example, then one of the most important things that you need to encounter there, or to be given there, is pain relief. Now, if you think about it, what does pain do? It separates you from yourself, from your neighbour, and from God. When you have even a small pain, that's all you can think about. You know, you stub your toe when you're coming out of the shower, that's all you can think about. So if you've got a big pain, then, you know, it takes over your whole life. So to give pain medication, actually, Stanley Hauerwas once said that pain is the enemy of community, and I think that's quite an interesting way of putting it. But if you're giving good pain medication, then it reconnects you with yourself, with your neighbour, and ultimately with God. So good pain medication, in a broad sense, is a spiritual intervention. And likewise, in the context of mental health, the good prescription of medication that enables people to get past those aspects of their experience that are really causing them difficulty, and to be able to live peacefully or peaceably, even in the midst of their experiences, is spiritual in that sense, because it reconnects people with self, God, and others. And so that's where that comes from, although I did articulate it in a slightly different way in the passage you quoted.
Let's move on to the section where you talk about hearing voices of schizophrenia. And I was absolutely fascinated. You mentioned that I think it's between 5 and 28% of people, some of whom are quite famous, and you mentioned a few, between 5 and 28% of people will hear voices at some point. And then you go on, and again, really interesting is you look at how the cultural response to that is very diverse. So you compare experiences of schizophrenia or hearing voices in America, India, and Ghana. And I wonder if you could just talk us through about the significance of those 3 different cultural responses, and what the significance of that one is if you're on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, so to your first point, I mean, depending on what study you look at will depend on the diversity of that figure. But the point is that it's a significant percentage of the non-psychiatric population, that is people who are not diagnosed as anything, hear voices. So Martin Luther King, Jesus, Muhammad, all these people heard voices. It's not particularly unusual. It's a difficulty they place in your life, it seems to be the key. So the study that you're referring to is by Tanya Luhrmann, who's an anthropologist from, I think she's in Stanford now. And she did a study of hearing voices across 3 cultures, United States, India, and Africa. And to cut a long story short, it's a fascinating piece of research which anybody that's listening should have a look at. It's very interesting. But she noted that within the United States, schizophrenia, which very often is the mode of psychosis which is associated with voices, is highly stigmatized. We have a particular theory of mind that says anything that comes from the outside is alien and terrifying. And we have a general conversation or general assumption that if you have something like schizophrenia, then it's incurable. You can take your medication and just make the best of your life. And so your possibilities are limited in terms of education, relationship, and social positioning. Whereas when she looked at these other cultures, it was quite different. In Chennai in India, the way in which voices worked out was some of them were nasty and unpleasant, that's absolutely right, but many of them were not, they were benign. And so you'd have the voice of the ancestors, for example, teasing them very often about sexual things and teasing them about things that they've done in the past and what have you. And likewise for Accra in Africa. And Tanya Luhrmann points out that one of the reasons for that is that these cultures have a different theory of mind. So whereas we might think that our mind should be only within our cranium in that sense, and anything coming out inside that is alien. That's not how these cultures think, because they have an openness. The mind belongs to the community. They have a history, or it's a tradition of interacting with voices and ancestors and various other things. So when you hear a voice, it's not necessarily terrifying, because culturally there's a way of explaining and defining that differs. But also importantly, in these contexts, there's also some really interesting research on Africa, where people with schizophrenia seem to recover more fully than people in the West. And one of the reasons for that in all these cultures is that the people don't use the language of schizophrenia, so it's not stigmatized in the way that it is. Now, people are kept within their community as much as possible, and very often people still have the opportunity to contribute, so that you can maybe still have a job or still be part of what's going on. And so the whole experience that people have is quite different in these kinds of cultures than in Western culture, where it's this big stigmatized thing that limits your life possibilities. And so therefore recovery, which doesn't mean getting rid of everything and going back to the way that people assume you should be. Your recovery is something just living with your condition is much more likely, because there's more possibilities.
So there's something about the Western culture, the way it thinks about the human identity being a particular kind of very controlled, autonomous, independent unit. That's what a human is. That's under a sort of pathologizing experiences of hearing voices in a way that's not true elsewhere around the world. Yeah.
Well, that's certainly what that study says, and it makes sense that should be the case, or could be the case.
Just spinning off on that, I mean, some of the people who are listening onto the call will have had experience of belonging to charismatic movements, and I wonder that some parts of Christianity and some parts of religion might be more amenable to voice hearing as well. Is that true?
Well, Tanya Luhrmann, again, she's got a fascinating book called When God Talks Back, which is an ethnography of the vineyard communities in America. And the question that underpins the whole of the book is, what does it mean when Christians say that God talks back? When you pray, God talks back. And to cut a long book short, she points, the way she explains it is that Christians use their spiritual disciplines, their prayer, their meditation, their contemplation, to create a mindset within which certain thoughts are filtered out as coming from God, and certain thoughts are filtered out as not coming from God. So one of the interesting things there is that they create a different theory of mind. So once again, the kind of Western theory of mind that says that the mind is only inhabits within a single skull, Christians open that up, and voices do come in, be that the voice of God or the voice of angels or whatever it is. But by this process of spiritual discipline and spiritual formation, they discern and decide what is not the voice of God. And so the whole book runs along that. So certain contexts, hearing voices is completely acceptable, but in some other contexts, it's not. And that tells you something quite interesting as well.
So in traditional language, it would be, I guess, what we call the discernment of spirits, maybe. Yeah. Let's shift. We're coming towards the end of the interview. Let's shift on to looking at bipolar disorder. And interestingly, you say that bipolar disorder is one of the few that probably does actually have a really firm biological cause. But then you warn of sort of focusing on what you call neuromania, over focusing on what goes on in the skull. We've been saying a little bit about this. I wonder if you could talk about neuromania and why that's a problem.
Well, neuromania, it's not my idea, but it's Raymond Tallis, who's a very interesting English philosopher, who's a former gerontologist who is now functions as a philosopher, just points out that neurology has a very loud voice in the conversations of almost everything within the Western world. And he suggests that, so neurology explains morality, ethics, religion, absolutely everything. And he suggests that this is actually a form of, he says it's a form of psychosis, and he's being flippant about it, like that we're completely obsessed with neurology. And then he gives the really fascinating example of the neurology of love, and says, well, what do you do? You take somebody, you place their head in a machine that measures brain waves, you show them pictures of people they love and people they don't know, measure the brain waves, and then you come up with a definition of what romantic love is at the end of that process. And he says it's just ridiculous, because basically love requires lovers. You can't have an intracranial understanding of what love is. And actually, he goes on to argue you can't really have an intracranial understanding of what the mind is. The mind is this formation of the mind and the practice of the mind. It's a social thing. And so the danger then, in terms of mental health, would be important as neurology is, and these neurologic dimensions are important. But the danger would be that you reduce complex human experiences to the smallest explanatory component and then think you know what these things are. And of course, you don't. You just have to have a conversation with somebody to know that you don't know. You know some things, but you don't know a lot of things.
Okay, so if that's the end we don't want to do, sort of disappearing off into the ether or within the head, the opposite presumably is about sort of actually helping somebody exist physically within community. So I wonder, how might a community of faith best support someone who's experiencing delusions? Or is it sort of maybe at the high of the bipolar stage? What could the community of faith do?
Well, I think the key for the community of faith in that context is to have a good relationship with the mental health professions, because there's certain aspects of mental health challenges when somebody is acutely unwell in that sense that requires professional intervention. And so I think that the key is that you have an ongoing conversation of a relationship with mental health services so that you can support the individual. So for the situation you're talking about where somebody is working with delusions, then the professionals are the best person to be able to help that individual at that moment in time. But there are some interesting chaplaincy interventions that suggest that rather than simply assuming that a delusion is a false fixed belief with no meaning beyond that, that actually oftentimes delusions can be very important for a person's identity. So I always remember a story by, I've forgotten her name, an American psychiatrist. It'll come back to me in a second matter. But she tells it's a story from the New York Times, and she tells a story of one night in the accident in the emergency room, where this guy came in and he thought he was a prophet, and he was bringing all sorts of information about the end of the world and various other things. And he says, "I suffer from for being a prophet." And he lifted up his shirt, and you can see he does suffer because he had the sarcosa to go with end-stage AIDS. He was suffering. He was in real difficulties. Now, what the psychiatrist had to think in that says, what do I do here? If I take away this delusion, then this guy will discover that he's a homeless man who's dying of AIDS. But if I leave this delusion, then there could be all sorts of other difficulties. And so she said it's a real challenge, because this delusion was giving him a positive identity. What she had to offer was taking that away. Now, in the end, she did give him medication and did take him in, but she said, "I've never worked out whether that was the right decision." And so she lives with that ambiguity, which I think is interesting. So in other words, delusions are highly problematic. We should certainly be working with them, with professionals, but also we should understand what they're doing, understand what they mean for that individual, and begin to think, what kind of identity can we help this individual to find once the more difficult aspects of the experience at that moment in time settle down.
It's only as you describe it, I've read that before. I was suddenly reminded of the book Life of Pi, and I guess if any of our viewers at the moment want a little insight about the different levels in which one could interpret something, Life of Pi is worth a read. Right, last couple of minutes before I open it out to the floor, as it were. You mentioned the language of demon possession. So towards the end, you look at that really tricky topic, and I know many of us will feel really cautious about wanting to use the language of demons and demon possession. And now, what I thought was really useful is you say, well, okay, well, why don't we just look at the New Testament about what actually there is there? And you show quite surprisingly that there isn't a very strong link between demon possession and mental illness at all. Could you just briefly tell us what there is?
Well, there isn't. Well, first of all, I think it's always a bit of a dangerous thing to do, to read 21st century diagnosis back into 2nd century Mediterranean culture. I think we'd be unwise not to do that. But when you look at the accounts of demon possession, most of them are physical. And rarely do we say, well, you've got a sore back, so therefore you must be demon possessed. And those which are not physical don't seem to me to bear any relevance to, any significant familiarity to, what's the word I'm looking for? It'll do, to the way in which we understand. So if you take the criterion from DSM-5 that we talked about earlier on and place it beside any of these guys, it's not the same thing. It's certainly not schizophrenia. You could maybe make a case that multiple personality disorders sits with the Gerasene demoniac, but you'd have to be stretching it quite a bit to do that, really. And so you have to wonder, why do we make that association? And Mark, you gave me one reason why we made that association as we were just warming up, so I'll pass that one on to you.
Oh, you want me? You might do. I was saying to John beforehand that as a medieval historian, I don't think you find a lot in the New Testament linking mental ill health and demon possession, but you can read a lot from 500, 600 through to the end of the 1500s, where saints are healing people who have conditions which I guess we might well talk about in mental health terms. And demonic language, I think, is possibly a late Roman medieval thing, not a New Testament thing.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, so I think that's such a good point. But I mean, there's a lot in that. But basically, my point would be, if you go to the New Testament, you really don't see it in the way that we oftentimes assume that we see it.
Last question before I hand over to the floor. Right at the end of the book, you talk about healing. And really interestingly, you talk about healing as not the absence of symptoms, but the healing in the language of shalom or wholeness. So just talk us a little bit about what that means when you talk about healing in the context of mental health challenges.
Yeah. Well, the idea of shalom is very important because the Bible doesn't have a word for biomedical health in the way that you and I might talk about it as an absence of illness. So the closest thing maybe is shalom, which means justice, righteousness, and all of its fullness, you know, across creation. But at the heart of that is right relationship with God. So to be healthy scripturally is to be in right relationship with God. Irrespective of your physical and psychological state. So you could be the most athletic sports person in the world and be really unhealthy. You could be dying of cancer and be really healthy according to that way of thinking. Which gives you a different perspective on what healing is. So very often when we think about healing, we think about curing. That healing is to do with curing. And you know, you can see a lot of that in the Gospels. It looks that way. Although the Gospels are always theological rather than medical, I think it's important to bear that in mind. But if you take something like the Jesus' encounter with the woman with the issue of blood, right? So she touches Jesus' robe, and immediately she's cured. And then Jesus is looking around. They have this conversation, and off she goes. Sends her off, and Jesus says, "Go, your faith has healed you." You're thinking, but she's already been, and then you think, well, maybe not. Healing is to do with reconnection, right? So Jesus sends her back into her community to be reconnected from a space that she'd been disconnected because of the discharge of blood, to be reconnected with the temple, to be reconnected with her family, and so on and so forth. So he sends her off in that sense because she's healed in a different way than the beginning of that story looks like. And in the context of mental health, it's the same. We maybe think, well, wouldn't it be fantastic to get rid of all of this stuff here? I said, maybe, but maybe it would also be fantastic just to keep connected, to have people around you, to help you connected with yourself, with others, with God in that sense. Maybe having a good community is a space where I can really find healing, even though I may have to live with this for the rest of my life.
So like in common with the rest of the book, this is a thick description, a broad description of what healing would mean, rather than purely an absence of one particular phenomenon.
That's right. That's exactly right.
It's absolutely wonderful to talk with you and ask questions. I've got lots of questions in the chat, so can I ask if anybody would like to do write in the Q&A, and I will try and do my very best to read them out. We've got 20 minutes or so. We'll go to 8:15. So let me just have a glance down. Near the beginning, someone asked, John, is there any evidence that the general decline in religious belief has led to an increase in mental health challenges?
I think it would be a difficult association to make directly. However, I don't think it's a coincidence that anxiety and depression are significantly on the rise within the culture, that it is losing its primary story to explain why you're here, who you are, where do you come from, where you're going to, and why. So I'm not aware of any research that draws that comparison directly, but I think you can make that assumption that there is a connection there between the, if you like, a major explanatory framework that religion really is in terms of who we are and where we're going, towards an explanation of life that is really quite thin and unencouraging, that we're just a mass of genes that are heading towards nothing very much. And so I suspect that anxiety and depression comes from that kind of existential uncertainty that's left in that gap. But as I say, if there is research that looks directly at that, I don't know what it is, but I could surmise.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here about delusions. Monica writes, I've experienced that a lot of people with mental health challenges have delusions about God and so on. Voices telling them that they can't die, they have supernatural powers and so on. What are these delusions about and how do we interpret them, she asks.
Yeah, well, it's tricky for Christians to talk about delusions because a lot of the core beliefs that we have, that we won't die, that Jesus rose from the dead, are kind of culturally abnormal. So it's sometimes difficult to disentangle, when it comes to religion, what is delusion, what is not. But the first thing I would say is that all spiritual experience is just that, it's spiritual experience. All religious experience is religious experience. So the fact that somebody is having a high and because of the bipolar disorder and having unusual spiritual experiences doesn't mean that these are not spiritual experiences. Okay, so it's not for us to say, oh, it's just the illness, because that's a mistake to say it's just the illness. Of course, there are certain things that people encounter that can be dangerous for them. So, for example, one woman with bipolar disorder that I spoke to, she really loved the high of bipolar disorder because she felt closer to God than at any other point. So she said, you know, if I could just live there forever, that would just be fantastic. So that's a nice thing in one sense. But then she went on to say, so much so that I actually do want to be with God forever. And so she has this wonderful experience which she wants to continue. And the way that she thinks she has to continue is by driving down the road in her car with her eyes closed, in the hope that her car will crash and she'll be with God. So the actual experience of God that she has could well be real and very important for her, but the consequences of that can be difficult. So that's a professional task to be able to hold on to that. Our task is to make sure that that experience is honoured, not simply, you know, it's subsumed into technical terms of diagnosis. But when it comes to that kind of spiritual experience, probably when somebody is going through the peak of their delusional experiences, it's not really possible for you or I to discuss that in that way, because you know, that's just not the best time to do that when somebody is going through that. But later on, it's a good space. So for the book I've been talking about here, all of these stories come in later on. They talk about a person's experiences, but they come in later on. And the way I think about it sometimes is it's possible to engage in retrospective spiritual direction. Now, by that I mean that when somebody has these really unusual experiences, and they are spiritual experiences, later on you can sit down with them and discuss what's durable, what lasts, what has been brought into their lives that will continue to be really, really important. And I think it's that space there that very often the church inhabits. And so that partnership between managing the big high and then making sense of it is probably quite a good way to look at the partnership between mental health services and churches.
Yeah, you wrote about retrospective spiritual direction, don't you? Accompanying people about, you know, let's look back over this experience and accompanying people. So maybe not in the moment, but afterwards.
No,
do that.
Exactly.
There's a lovely quote that Kathy's put in here from a book, Prayer in the Night by Tish Harrison Warren, which I don't know, but I'll just read the quote. When I could not pray, the church said, "Here are prayers." When I could not believe, the church said, "Come to the table and be fed." When I could not worship, the church sang over me the language of faith. This idea that maybe the community can provide what you lack at that time.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, that's a really good example of the way in which you can hold feelings and experience of another person literally, and then pass them back again later on. So you're struggling at one moment, but you can hold this for me, and I can hold that for you, and you can't hold this for me. Yeah, it's good.
Okay, there's a question here which I shall just read straight off. I'm not quite sure at the end if I've got it entirely right. This person writes, the lovely thing about the neurobiology of trauma is that it demonstrates that sanctuary, love, compassion, human connection and empathy are what heals. It shows the mechanics of injury and healing. I would love to see this translated into how we relate to people at church. But do you feel that labelling traumatized people as vulnerable puts up a wall?
Well, I think the basic point in there is really important because the brain is plastic. It does respond to a variety of experiences. It's not like your nails in your head are just genetically programmed. It actually takes the shape and form of all your experiences, including your traumatic experiences. So yes, to have a knowledge of that and to know that you actually, when you engage in somebody in counselling, for example, you're actually, it's a physical thing as well as a psychological thing. There's a real power in that and the way in which we can shape and form one another's bodies for good and for bad. The issue, what was the question at the end, Mark?
But do you feel that labelling traumatized people as vulnerable puts up a wall? I guess if we're too explicit about this stuff, does it take?
Yeah, I mean, there's an ongoing conversation about whether vulnerability is the best way to frame issues such as that, and it can be difficult, and it can be maybe the wrong kind of language. At one level, we're all vulnerable because we're creatures and because we're made by God in that sense, so we're contingent. But vulnerability the language of vulnerability can be really difficult for people going through traumatic experiences. So I'd always be wary of it, and wary of if you like, labeling people in that way, because that does have connotations which I think the questioner recognises. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think you'd have to be very sensitive about it, careful with it.
There's a lovely question here about childhood. How do you understand the links between our experiences of being parented and our spirituality, such as for people challenged by depression or anxiety due to an insecure attachment style, who find themselves endlessly chasing that deus absconditus, the absent God, craving a hug? So what's the connection, or is there a connection between the way in which you were brought up, the spirituality you developed, and then how you end up praying and acting out?
I think that there is clearly a connection, because spirituality to some extent, and I say to some extent, is a learned skill. And so you learn the basic structures of your spirituality, your spiritual formation, through your family, through your church, through your Sunday school and all these things. So you're shaped and formed in a particular way. Of course, the Holy Spirit is a part of that, but we are material beings, and we are shaped and formed in that way. And you can't really get away from your childhood, for the reasons that we talked about a few moments ago. The whole idea of neuroplasticity means that what goes on in your childhood shapes and forms your brain. And although there's all sorts of changes that go on in adolescence and as you grow into adulthood, the reality is that shape and form remains there. It's not, I don't think it remains there in a sense that it determines everything that happens to you, but it profoundly influences everything that happens to you. So when you get into your adulthood, you already have a template or a shape or a form for your spirituality, for better or for worse, which you then have to work with. When I say for better or for worse, what I mean by that is that some of us spend our whole lives pushing against our childhood spirituality, pushing against the way that our parents taught us about God, and pushing against the God that we were brought up with. You know, but I'm a little bit like that. I was brought up in a very kind of safe, secure, but quite liberal Christian family, good family. But they did have particular understandings of what truth was and truth wasn't, what the scripture was, and all these things. And later on, when I became a Christian, or made the decision to become a Christian, a lot of that stuff I had to push against. And a lot of stuff I was pushing into was actually pushing against my parents, because, you know, everybody has that tension there. So for better or for worse, you're pushing against something. So the short answer is yes, it's profoundly formative, but it's not necessarily definitive.
A couple of other questions here then. I'm just going to pick a few. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes before we finish. What's your opinion on glossolalia, so speaking in tongues, and whether or not it is a neurological delusion?
I believe that speaking in tongues is what Paul says speaking in tongues is. I mean, you can trace down the neurological basis for prayer, for speaking in tongues, for all these sorts of things. That doesn't define it. This takes us back to that issue of the danger of reductionism. When you can see what's going on in somebody's brain, you think you know what it is. But no, I think glossolalia is just something that emerges from the interaction of the spirit with the brain and manifests itself in whatever way it does. So
some people dance, some people paint, some people speak in tongues.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
right. Another question. In your book, you describe joy as an assured presence, the presence of Jesus. Would you use this definition with a non-Christian too? And I guess this is a good jumping off point for asking the wider sense of, okay, what about other faith communities?
Yeah, well, the basic, I wouldn't necessarily use that particular form of words for non-Christians or for people from other traditions, unless I was in a situation where I was having that conversation around the specifics of my religion and their religion. But the basic concepts and ideas that health is more than simply moving away from your illness, and it's finding a grounding in something beyond yourself. I would still hold on to that, and I'd use some derivation of that language depending on who I was speaking to. If it was an opportunity where I could explain my own position, that'd be great. But if I really just wanted this person to be able to find a way of thinking about their situation that brings them health and peace and well-being, then I may use different language to locate myself within their particular context.
Really practical question. This is one of the last ones that just came up. When someone comes down after a psychotic episode and are gutted by what they've done, aggression, money spent, delusions of grandeur, isn't it best to say you were very unwell? Also, should I encourage someone who has bipolar to be open about it, or will they be stigmatized? How do we reduce stigma?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, when that happens, people do it because the experiences have been overwhelming, and they have been, in that sense, unwell. So yeah, I think that's a valid way of helping them to find forgiveness of themselves, and to understand their experience in terms that are not purely negative. So I think that I'm comfortable. I would be comfortable with articulating things in that way. And the last part of the question, Mark?
The last part of the question was, also, should I encourage someone who has bipolar to be open about it, or will they be stigmatized? How can I reduce the stigma?
That's a difficult one, because, as I mentioned earlier on, religious communities are not always safe places to be. And in relation to that question and these kinds of questions, I would recommend that people looking at this just now have a look at the materials that are produced by Sanctuary Ministries. It's a Vancouver-based organisation, but they now have a London arm. And their intention is to wrestle with exactly these kinds of practical questions and theological questions. But the good thing is that it's a resource that's designed for use within religious communities. So it's very practical, very helpful, and very informative. And so that's where you should go. Sanctuary Ministries would be a good space for you to go to find out how to deal with these kind of problematic situations.
You gazumped my final question, John. That's really not, I was going to say, where can people go for? So at the end of your book, there's a lovely appendix of resources, and sanctuarymentalhealth.org. So no spaces, sanctuarymentalhealth.org would be the place to go for that one. There's a couple of people have written in the comments rather than questions about the role of the church being a space where it's okay to manifest stuff, for people to run around, to shout out loud, and just to be accepted, a space for that. And I guess that's also wider for other sorts of communities as well, where spaces where people can just be themselves.
Yeah.
Right, just scrolling down. Let's see whether there's one more that we can end on. Otherwise, I shall pluck one of my own. I think I'm going to just pick out one of mine. Okay, my final question then, John, is we talked a bit about how the church can support people with challenges, but let's flip it round. What can those who experience these sorts of things give to us, teach us in the faith communities? What can we learn?
Oh, lots of things. I mean, first of all, you can learn that your experience is not the only way in which people encounter the world, which is a profoundly challenging and important thing. So the key thing about mental health ministries, it's not just us giving to them, it's us all together learning from one another. And interestingly, I went to a church I spoke at a church in Vancouver a few years ago, and they had a preaching team in there, and every week, before the sermon was preached, the preaching team, the preacher had to preach to the preaching team, and then the preaching team would give feedback. And one of the things that they're planning on doing is to have people with disabilities and people with mental health challenges as part of that preaching team and part of that discernment team. So when people are preaching, and particularly go back to the issue of language, and people are using inappropriate language and not thinking through the issues or not bringing to the fore certain issues, then this team, which includes everybody, speaks to that. And hopefully, every time a sermon is preached, it will be able to reach the broad range of people within that particular community. And I think that's a good example of the way that you can just incorporate a variety of perspectives in a way that helps all of us to see things more clearly in the grander scheme of things.
So maybe we could be reminded that we're a body rather than just one sort of monolithic.
Exactly.
We're many parts. John, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for speaking to me tonight. I want to thank you for this wonderful book. I would encourage anybody who wants to know more to read it. Unlike some theology books, it's quite easy reading. You've got a lovely reading style. You get the testimony, so you do hear people's authentic voices who are speaking about under these three conditions you look at, especially major depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. People talking in their own language about what it's like and how they relate in faith. And so I was very grateful for that. And you made me think in an enormous way about language and being really careful about how we use language. And I think that's quite prophetic. So thank you so much tonight. Thank you to everybody who's come and listened to this lecture. I'd like to give a little shout out for the next thing that we're going to be offering. The chaplaincy runs some other public lectures called Café Théologique. You'll see on your screen now that on Monday, the 21st of February, we're going to be running an in-person event in Reading. We take over the upstairs of 0 Degrees Bar near Bridge Street. That's near St Mary Butts. And our speaker will be a theologian, Alan Race, who's a theologian of religious diversity and interfaith conversation. His topic is religious pluralism as a sign of religious hope. So if you want to come and learn how different faiths can work together and understand each other and actually grow out of that experience, then come and join me on 7:30 on the 21st of February to listen to Alan. We'll hopefully also video that and maybe even live stream it at the same time. If you'd like to know about anything else that we do, please drop us an email at chaplaincy@reading.ac.uk and we'll add you to our mailing list. But otherwise, it just remains for me to say thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you very much to John. Thank you to Jenny and Joe and all those who've been supporting us in the background for tonight's event. And I wish you a very good evening. Good night.